on the chat if you want to introduce yourselves to everyone. And as a last reminder, please always mute yourself if you are not speaking to ensure that everyone can have a good audio quality. I pass the floor to Benoit, and please note that also this call will be recorded for your information. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Petros, and hi again to everyone. So I'm here to present to you an update on the EU legislation on 112. Just before I start, and to add a bit more about myself, I joined EENA 3 years ago, and since then I've been busy following all the legislative deployments around the topic, doing some kind of lobbying actions as well. So I'll be also able to give you some kind of overview of also the context of some provisions that are included in the new legislation. So let's jump into the topic. So yeah, most of you know already the Universal Service Directive, which is the main EU legislation at the moment for emergency calls. And in a few months, you will have to forget about this text because it will no longer exist, and it will be replaced by the European Electronic Communications Code. So you can also call that the EECC, or simply the code if you are active following that legislation. So just to give you some introductory elements about the EECC, so it's the new, or let's say upcoming EU legislation on telecoms. So that includes not only emergency calls, but everything about telecoms, like fiber and 5G, and also about the contract between the mobile operators and their customers and so on. So it covers a lot of things. The whole proposal was something like 300 pages, so that was really a lot, but there are some parts on emergency calls. Yeah, so it will replace the Universal Service Directive that will no longer exist when the European Electronic Communications Code will be active, and it will serve as the main EU legislation on emergency calls. And this last point is very important. So if some of you are like now active on Facebook and so on, please just be attentive for 2 minutes, because this is very important to follow the rest of this presentation, also because I don't like when people have fun without me. So this is a directive. So a directive is mandatory for all the member states of the European Union and also the European Economic Area. And what it's said in a directive is basically the text sets some goals or some targets that the member states should reach within a specific deadline. So the member states will have to implement what is said in this text into their national law, which gives them some flexibility in the implementation, sometimes to define how to fulfill those obligations actually. So there's some flexibility in the technology to use, for instance, and this is what we call the transposition. So this is very important to remember, that what is said in the text will have to be implemented in the national law of the member states. So you will have to be also very careful in how it is implemented in your country. So it will be very important that you check this transposition period. Usually the member states have 2 years to implement the provisions of the directive. So what I'm going to say now, the member states will have 2 years. So it will not apply from one day to the other. So you have to be a bit patient. So before jumping into the EECC, I'd like to recall a bit how we came here and what was the process, so that it will also allow us to better understand what the next steps are. So if I go back to the basics, there are 3 institutions, main institutions in the European Union decision process. So we have the European Commission, that is mainly composed of technocrats, and the role is both to draft the new proposals, the new directives, for instance, and also to make sure that the directives are correctly implemented in the member states. But the Commission, so they propose a text, but then they don't have any voting power when it's about a directive. Then we have the European Parliament that represents the citizens of the European Union, and the Council of the European Union, or simply the Council, which represents the governments of the 28 member states. And it's both the Parliament and the Council that vote the text, and they can also amend the proposals from the Commission. But it's important to remember that the Commission proposes a text, and then Parliament and Council amend and vote the text, of course, in the same words. This applied to the ECC proposal. So, as I just said, it started from the European Commission proposing a new text. That was 2 years ago, a bit more than 2 years ago, in September 2016. The proposal was released. Then it arrived to the Parliament and to the Council. Parliament voted some amendments in October 2017. So you saw that there was 1 year during which the Parliament had time to really go deeper on the text and propose some amendments and vote them and so on. And shortly after, within the same time frame, the Council also voted some amendments. The problem is that the amendments from the Parliament and the amendments from the Council were not the same. So in that case, you need a conciliation between all those institutions, still involving the European Commission, just for the discussion. And this conciliation procedure is called the trialogues. This lasted for more or less 1 year, until the 5th of June 2018, where the last trialogue was organized between those three institutions. And finally, all the EU decision makers came to an agreement, which was great news because it's been many months working on getting this agreement. And about this very topic of emergency calls, an agreement was found on many different points, and this is what I'm going to present right now. So let's start directly with the first of this point, is the caller location of emergency calls. Some of you may know that already since the previous Universal Service Directive, which is from 2009, the member states are already forced to use the caller location information to locate emergency calls, basically. But this, as you see in the table here, this does not include any specific information as to which technology should be used. The main improvement that is brought in this EECC directive is to say that, the caller location that is used by the PSAPs should include both the network-based location information, which already all the PSAPs have or should have, and where available handset-derived caller location information. Handset-derived caller location information is the location that you have in your smartphone. So the GPS or GNSS, I should say, and the Wi-Fi. So this is much more accurate, and this is something that is quite recent. When they voted the Universal Service Directive in 2009, it was the very beginning of the smartphones. So the legislator at the time did not think about including that. Now, this is one big improvement that was brought in the European Electronic Communications Code, and it's an amendment that was voted by the European Parliament. So just remember, because this is maybe one of the biggest changes of the ECC, that now handset-derived location information will have to be used to locate emergency calls. One example of that is AML, for advanced mobile location. If you need help to deploy AML in your country, you can just contact me, and I will help you. Something that is also new is that before it was said in the text that the provision of caller location information should be free to the PSAP. Now it also adds that it's also free to the end user, so the person calling the emergency services. The end user shouldn't pay to send his or her location information to the PSAP. Now a bigger, equally important, but that led to much more work, is reverse 112. So as some of you may know, we are a bit late in most of Europe to alert the population when there's a hazard or a major crisis that happens. Most of countries are still using sirens, which is a system that dates back to the Second World War. So that's a bit dated. While in many countries outside of Europe and in some member states of Europe, they're using much more modern technologies, using the telephone networks to inform everybody directly on the telephone, and this is much more efficient. So this is something that EENA has been pushing in the last 10 years, is to put that also in the EU legislation. And we finally managed to do that with the European Electronic Communications Code. There was nothing in the initial proposal from the European Commission. So we've been very active in lobbying to get it in the legislation. And as you can see in this article with the European Electronic Communications Code, there is something. I will now explain you what is in it, because it's very important to understand this whole article. So this, first of all, the most basic is the mandatory implementation of a public warning system in all the member states of the European Union and the European Economic Area. And the transmission of the alerts, the public warning alerts, should be done by the telephone networks, which means that there are basically two technologies that can do that. It's cell broadcast and location-based SMS to warn all the people on their telephone of an ongoing attack or an upcoming threat. Of course, the member states keep the competence to define which message is sent, in what language, in what format, with what technology, and so on. But remember what is said in the legislation. Also note that here a specific deadline is set, which is 42 months after the entry into force of this directive. So which means that when it will be voted, the member state will have 3.5 years to implement such system. It's a bit longer than the rest because the whole process takes time. You can see always on the right part of the screen the article that is quoted on the left. It's some explanation. Then as you can see in the slide here, all the citizens and the visitors in a specific area should be alerted. That's also very important to note. You cannot limit yourself just to the people who live in an area. You should also alert the visitors. And this is expressly specified here in a recital. Just in a parte to precise what a recital is. Recital is something that is in the legislation, is not binding in itself, but it's usually something that is added to give the context of an article and to give more explanation, sometimes some useful definitions and so on. So here it's very helpful, this recital. The numbering is to be changed, but this recital that is quoted is very helpful to understand what is meant by end users concerned. So as I said, there are two main technologies that do that at the moment. It's cell broadcast and location-based SMS, each of them with their assets and with their weakness, let's say. So then it will be up to each member state to define the technology it wants. And for that, EENA will also is also at the disposal of all the governments to help on this choice. Okay. Yeah, I just hear somebody talking at the same time, so if you can mute yourself, maybe.
Pentru că în momentul de față, eu nu știu care este e-cardul pe care l-avem. Pentru că poate e-cardul.
Yeah, that is much better right now. Yeah, so there is a possible. Okay, I see here one question from Robert Manenica that is very useful. Is what is location-based SMS? So location-based SMS is a technology that helps also sending an SMS alert to the population in case of alerts when the member state or the public authorities in the member state define that there's an alert and all the people should be warned. They can send an SMS to all the population in a specific area. And if you want to dig more about the topic, there is documents from EENA that is available online on our website, and I'll be happy also to give more information offline. Welcome, Robert. If you look now at the alternative, because still in the same article, actually, the article 110, there is a possibility for alternative that is taken into account by the EU decision maker. They included that alternative. So what we will look at here is what are the conditions to implement such alternatives. because here what we call alternatives is alternatives to the use of electronic communication services, which is the use of telephony. So a common example would be a national app to warn the citizens. However, 5 conditions should be met to implement this alternative instead of the other technologies. One is that it should be as efficient as network-based technologies in terms of people covered and the capacity to reach those end users. This is clearly said in the article. You can see it on the right part of the screen. The other conditions are set out in the recital that I have not quoted here. The second condition is that the reception of the alert should be easy. So the person should not, the end user, let's say, should not be asked to like log in an app or to download something or anything. The reception of the alert should be very easy. The people entering a country should be warned and informed on how to get such alerts. So, you know, when you travel to another country, you get an SMS telling you what's the cost of sending an SMS, what's the national emergency number, and so on. This SMS will also have to include how to get public warning alerts if the alternative is chosen. The transmission of the alert should be free to the user, whether it's a citizen or a visitor. And of course, this alternative should comply with the European and national privacy rules. So as you see, a lot of conditions must be met to accept such alternatives. And based on that, BEREC, which is the Bureau of European Regulators for electronic communications, will be tasked to define some guidelines on how to accept such alternatives or not. Just in the parte, you will see a lot BEREC in this presentation. BEREC is like the main association for telecoms regulators for the European Union. It's based in Riga, and it's like an official institution that represents all the European telecom regulators. Okay, and last element of this part on reverse 112 is the evolution to a pan-European reverse 112, so something that would be done at the European level. This is something that is a bit like an utopia at the moment, because Europe has no competence about public warning, so this remains a national competence. However, the Commission is tasked to assess whether this is something that would be feasible and beneficial to the member states. So this is something that will be looked at and assessed by the European Commission, but nothing will be done concretely at this moment. So that's it for my presentation on public warning. Is there some question at the moment about what I just presented, the public warning part? Because I know it's quite a big topic. Okay, I don't hear or read anything, which means it's everything.
Sorry, Benoit. Yeah. I was unmuting myself. A quick question. So when you mentioned that the visitors entering the country should be aware of that, would be an extension to the current SMS that I, for instance, I get when I travel to other country by my network provider, or how should it be?
So it's either an extension or a separate SMS, one of the two. Just to mention that this SMS just applies in case there's an alternative that is chosen. In case, for instance, a country implements a national app, in that case, all visitors should be informed. And yeah, this is either the same SMS or another one.
Here the question is that, let's say, when you usually go to another country, you get this information SMS from your own operator.
Yeah.
Do I understand it correctly that actually here this operator should send an informative SMS to whose network visitors are coming? So it's like vice versa, or,
yeah.
or which way?
Well, in such case, I would say that yes. Here again, like this is an example of like how directives are sometimes unclear, because this is something that is not said in a directive, so it will be have to be forced by the member states when they transpose the directive. But I guess that would be the solution, yes. And I understand it's very hard to think about that from your perspective and from my perspective as well, which is why, to be honest, if I see those 5 conditions, it's extremely hard to meet all those conditions, to be honest. So that's why I don't really see any credible alternative to what was described in my first parts on like cell broadcast and localized base SMS.
Okay, but this has to be kind of cleared out so that
it's not clear at all in the directive, so it will be at the moment of the transposition.
Okay.
Is there any other question?
Yes, Benoit, more a comment. This is Freddie McBride from the ECO. More a comment than a question, just in relation to the slide that's currently on the screen, Article 110 by 42 months. That sounds like a long time, but the member states, just for the benefit of the audience, the member states will have 2 years from the entry into force of the EECC to transpose the legislation. So they'll be busy transposing all aspects of the code.
Yeah.
So at the end of that 2 years, there will be 18 months, which I guess that's when action is required by the member states. And it's probably also important to point out that the BEREC guidelines will come around that time, or at least a couple of months before that time, because BEREC has 18 months from entry into force of the code, at which point their guidelines should be coming out around the time the member states should have transposed the legislation. That's it.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment, Freddie. That's very helpful. Yeah, and my advice, I see a lot of people here working at ministries of the interior. My advice would be also not to like wait for until you have only 18 months left to implement it. It's a serious question that you must already think about. So yeah, EENA remains at the disposal of all the public authorities to guide you on such choice and such research at the first part.
Just one remark from my side, Benoit.
Yes.
Dieter speaking. So just I welcome very much the new principle from the directive, but I want to make people aware that at the end of the day, everybody has to have a modular system to ensure that 100% of people are alerted, and that means also those who don't have a smartphone. So do not think that with this solution everything is solved. So, but this is up to the countries to deal with that problem.
Yeah, that is correct, and it has always been EENA's position to defend a multi-channel public warning. So, which means that smartphone is one, but of course there are many other channels to order the population.
Well, this is what I call modular. You know, different ways of communication, but at the end of the day, you should reach 100% of the people.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. And as I'm here on this slide, I would just like to add one small comment. Some of you might be scared to read in the Article 110 the part when public warning systems regarding imminent blah blah are in place. This means actually that the reason behind that wording is that the European Union doesn't have the competence to tell the member states to have a public warning system in place. But what here we understand as public warning system is includes sirens, for instance. So in that regard, all the member states already have a public warning system in place. So just to give you some information about the wording of this article. I heard... yeah?
Benoit, does it also, it says mobile number-based interpersonal communication. If we talk, for example, about machine-to-machine modems, which are fitted into cars, is that included?
That's a good comment. As you see here, we talk about mobile number-based interpersonal communication services. So that means that it's not included, the machine-to-machine.
Okay. Another question related to the reverse 112. You mentioned that only for the app-based solution, information to visitors entering the country is required.
Yeah.
So can you confirm that there is no need for that in a cell broadcast or location-based SMS solution. Not even like directives or instructions on how to configure your device, for example.
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
I can imagine, for example, for cell broadcast solutions, you might need to configure a channel or something like that.
Yeah.
There are no directives for information to visitors.
No, there is
required in the. There's nothing required. Okay.
No.
Yeah, last one. Sorry, too. With regards to the situation in the UK,
yes,
with Brexit and all that, what is the expectation of this legislation in the UK?
That's a very good question to which I don't have a clear response. Nobody would have in Brussels, no, in London actually, because at the moment the United Kingdom is still a member of the European Union. So at the moment this is mandatory for the UK. However, member states have 2 years to implement such directive, or 3 years and a half for reverse 112. And at that time, most probably, the UK will no longer be a member of the EU. So in that case, this legislation will not apply to the EU. So I would say that if the UK effectively leaves, yes, this legislation will not apply. But then it depends also on under what conditions the UK leave, because this legislation is also mandatory on the members of the European Economic Area, which is Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So if the UK negotiates the membership to the EEA, then yeah, they will have to apply this legislation. So I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer to your question.
Okay, thank you.
Benoit Vivier, Regola.
Yeah.
What do you intend with location-based SMS? Does it mean that the network have to send SMS on a specific region on a part of the network? Can you clarify this, please?
Yeah, this is an SMS that can be sent to all the citizens in a determined area. You can narrow it down to the city, or sometimes even smaller than a city.
Okay, so it's something that the network can do, I think.
It would use the telephone network, but like the initiation of this message is always the competent public authorities who will, like, let's say, define the message and so on, but then they would use the telephone networks, yes.
Yeah, of course. So it's not location based in the sense that the location of the receiver, okay, is something that the network identified the shell that should send the SMS, probably.
Yes, but basically, yeah, that's basically you would inform all the people who are connected to a cell in the city of, well, a city that is defined. So.
Yes, at the first glance. Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Okay, if there's no more question on reverse 112, anyway, I'm available later if you want. We can move to the next item, which is accessibility to people with disabilities. Which is also quite hard to understand at the beginning. So just a recap that the Universal Service Directive in 2009 already added the principle of equivalent access to that enjoyed by other end users. So this directive, as you can see, the provisions are very vague, and this led also to an implementation that is not really satisfactory. What does that mean, equivalent access, you know? So all of this led to the fact that the legislation was not so well implemented. And the European Electronic Communications Code make at least things a little bit clearer by adding the principle of, as you see here, it's in bold, through emergency communications. So I anticipate your question, because I had the same. What is an emergency communication? So this is specified in the recital. So this is why I explained you the importance of a recital to understand a legislation. And you can find here in the recital 255 a very clear definition that emergency communications are means of communication that include not only voice communications, but also SMS, messaging, videos, or other types of communications. For example, real-time text, total conversation, and relay services. So in principle, all of those services are covered in the legislation and should be made available to people with disabilities, so mainly the deaf community. That is for the principle, and that helps us to understand better the article that is written in the EECC. However, here again, the transposition phase, so the implementation into the member states' national law will be here very important also to define which kind of emergency communications will be included in a country-per-country basis. I see a comment, sound is gone. Can you hear me, the others? Oh, okay, I hear some yes. So
yes.
Okay, super. So Stein, that might be a problem with your site. And the last part of this article is also describing another legislation, which is the European Accessibility Act, which will come in the future as well. But I won't go into the details for that because it's really about the products and services. But just for the PSAP side, just so you understand that now there's this principle of emergency communications. And as I said before, that includes SMS, messaging, video, real-time text, etc. Okay, first, before I move to the next item, is there any question for the accessibility for people with disabilities? No, I don't hear any, which is good. Yeah, Tadas rightly mentioned that this directive, the European Accessibility Act, is currently under discussion, and the discussions are taking years, actually. So I guess Tadas, you sent the reference to this legislation. Thank you. Okay, next item is also very tricky, is the access to 112 from online platforms. And I remember I've been following the whole legislative discussions around 112, and especially at the beginning of the process, all the discussions were about which online platforms should provide access to 112. Should Skype provide access to 112? Should Facebook Messenger provide access, etc., etc.? So there are a lot of online platforms, and it was very hard also to find an agreement that is suitable to all the stakeholders. And yeah, I see that Jan reacts to, I mean, potentially Tinder is a communication platform, so you might ask them or not to provide access to 112. So that all those debates that led to many discussions, of course. And to understand the scope of the next obligations, let's first distinguish two categories of apps. Okay, that is much better now. On the left side, we have Skype, and here I will just speak about Skype out, the part where you can call somebody directly a number, and Viber. So it's apps where you can dial a number in your communication. So those apps, we call that the number-based interpersonal communication services, or you can just call them for the purpose of this directive, the NBICS. However, as number-based interpersonal communication services also include the traditional telephone services, we also talk here about network-independent providers of number-based interpersonal communication services. You see here how hard my work was in the past 3 years with all those strange names. On the right side of this guy, you have the apps where you don't dial properly a number. Some of you will tell me, yeah, but with WhatsApp, you need my phone number and so on. But in that case, the phone number is just used as a login, if I may say. So you don't really dial a number with WhatsApp. So this category is called the number-independent interpersonal communication services. So you have number-based on one side, number-independent on the other side. Now that this distinction is clear, we can study each of them. So first about the number-based communication services. I'm sorry, there's a lot of text, but I also tried to shorten it. So the text is actually much longer in the directive. In principle, the number-based communication services, such as Skype, Out, or Viber, should be required to provide access to 112 or to any national emergency number. However, the text acknowledges some technical limitations for Skype or Viber to provide reliable and accurate access to the emergency services. First of them is that Skype and Viber, they know in which country you are, but then they don't know exactly where you are. So this might create some problems to route the call to the appropriate PSAPs. So in that case, you would need the establishment of a one-stop shop. This is what we call a one-stop shop. So a single entry point for the country that would receive all the Skype calls or all the Viber calls in the country. If no such single entry point is provided, then Skype or Viber cannot know where to route the call, unfortunately. So this technical limitation is taken into account by the decision makers here. And you can see here in the recitals, especially the last sentences, that if there's no standard that is already existed and implemented, then the number-based interpersonal communication services should not be required to provide access to emergency services. However, if that's the case, or if they just can't provide the caller location information to the PSAPs, then they should also inform the users that they can't connect to 112. If you look at the number independent communication services, here I just kept WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, but there are many other platforms. In that case, the EU decision makers were kind of balanced between two positions. On the one side, there's the will to have a legislation that is future-proof, that in 5 or 10 years, you can still apply this legislation, even if maybe WhatsApp has, like the use of WhatsApp have reached a very, very high level. On the other side, there's the need not to stifle innovation, and also the fact that today it's maybe not really reliable as a means of communication and so on. So there were really a lot of talks about whether WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger should provide access to 112. And I have to say, I quite like the agreement that was found. It says that basically at the moment, WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger are not required to provide access to 112. However, in the future, maybe in 10 years, everybody will use just WhatsApp to contact the others, and they will have forgotten how to use just the simple telephone option of a smartphone. In that case, it can be the mandate can be extended by the EU decision makers by specific procedures, and to assess that, the BEREC, which is the European Bureau of Telecom Regulators that I described, BEREC is charged with every 3 years publishing an opinion on several things that are in this directive, but among them, there's I will quote here, to what extent effective access to emergency services is threatened by the increased use of such platforms. So every 3 years, BEREC will have to do reports whether it considers that there's a threat or not. Is there any question about what I just said about online platforms and 112?
Yeah, Benoit, this is Gabe at Rapid SOS. For Skype and Viber and the number-based services, yes. I didn't quite get the conclusion there. If there is no obvious ability to route, then they're not required to have to route emergency calls, correct?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's pretty. The whole recital is pretty long. So, I mean, when it's offline, I will invite you to have a look at this recital, and I can send you the full version. But basically, the network providers are the network independent number-based communication services. In principle, have to route to connect to 112, but sometimes it's just not possible. So what the legislation says, you can hear it, it's probably in the middle of the recital. Member states should ensure that standards ensuring accurate and reliable routing and connection to the emergency services are implemented as soon as possible. So at the moment it's not implemented. So when it's not implemented, such apps should not be required to provide access to 112.
Okay.
When there will be such standards, yes, they will have to.
Okay. So eventually, yes, but for the time being, no.
Yes, exactly. This being said, there are already some countries that provide this single entry point. I think that 3 or 4 countries in the EU, and in that case, Skype Out, for instance, provide access to 112.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't hear any other question. Okay, super. So I can move to the next part, and then it will be much more easy to understand. Next item is transnational emergency calls. If you work in a PSAP or have worked in a PSAP, you are really aware of this, is that sometimes there are some people who call the emergency services to report something that is happening in another country. So in that case, the emergency services would ideally need some kind of, let's say, directory to contact emergency services in other countries. So at that time, today, there is the EENA database that is already existing. That is a database of emergency services long numbers that is made available only to emergency services, of course. But ideally, and what EENA has already said, is that we would like an official institution to take care of it. And that's why this has been added in the legislation, that BEREC shall maintain such a database. Here, when we talk about E164 numbers, it's long numbers. So for the case of Belgium, like plus 32 something, to ensure that emergency services are able to contact each other. And the last sentence is interesting: if such a database is not maintained already by another organization. And actually, CEPT is currently, jointly with BEREC, setting up such a database, and this database will actually be hosted by CEPT. And to have more information about that, you can contact my colleague Jerome, and also I know that Freddie is also here at the call. So Freddie works for CEPT, so if you have any question about that, just raise your voice. I don't hear any. Okay, super. Anyway, we're still available by email later, but this is certainly a big advancement also for the emergency services in Europe to be able to contact each other.
Yeah, Benoit,
Yes.
Just a question to that. Will be any chance that other countries will join this one? Because we know that not all countries of Europe are currently in EENA database.
Yeah.
For reasons. So would the legislation create a better situation to bring the countries in? Or I mean, it's not. They are not obliged to do that. I mean, I do not see any obligation here.
Yeah, here there's indeed.
There are countries. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. So your question is about whether the countries are required to participate in this database or not. Perhaps, Freddie, do you want to reply on this?
Yes. So if you look at the letter of the legislation, it places an obligation on BEREC to host a database, but it doesn't place an obligation on the member states to provide information for that database. But I guess that's the spirit of the legislation. And of course, it remains to be seen whether or not there will be a need to go to another level with legislation to actually require member states, to mandate them to provide it. Certainly, when we started to look at this issue, some EU member states raised the concern that they would not participate in anything that wasn't backed by EU legislation. So it's now backed by EU legislation, albeit it stops short of explicitly mandating each country to provide information to the database. So I think it's probably enough. And let's see how it goes. I mean, we're technically ready now to host this database. We are EENA. We have an agreement with EENA. They will stop circulating their Excel spreadsheet at the end of this year. We have 18 countries who have sent us letters, so they're effectively signed up. And we have, at the moment, only 7 PSAPs are in, but that's because they just need to return the participation agreement. And of course, we've always recognized that the administrative side of this would always be more difficult than the technical side of it. But we're making progress, and I think that we will see now, and this is very helpful, this legislation, we will see all countries in Europe, and not just in the EU, but certainly the organization hosting this has 48 member states in continental Europe, if you like. So we would like to see it extended outside that, and we have had interest from countries outside of Europe who would like to participate as well. So I think that the future of this is very positive and will be a very useful back office tool for the PSAPs. I just sorry to go on, but I provided my email address in the chat window. So if there are any PSAPs out here that have not so far been made aware of this, please feel free to contact me for more information, or as the slide says there, contact Jerome Paris at EENA, and we've been in contact on this over the last few months. Thanks.
And if I can add an example to the discussion, Jerome speaking from EENA. Yesterday, actually, we received a call from 112 emergency control room in Antwerp, so in Belgium. They needed to get in touch with 112 Bratislava in Slovakia, and they couldn't reach this other country. So they contacted us, and we basically provided the number of this control room. So this is really something that is useful. This is a kind of request that we get very often. So it's really a database that we need to improve to have more countries. It's true, Jan, but I'm pretty sure that more countries will join, because now we have something more secured. And before, when EENA was maintaining this database, it was a bit something that was preventing some countries to join. That basically EENA was not an EU body, was not safe, etc., etc. So now Freddie and his team have developed something that is very secured. They are an EU body, so I'm pretty sure we're going to have more countries. Yeah, voilà. I hope it answers your question, Jan.
I have also a question. I'm Hermann Bühler from Austria. I wonder, does the database also contain the areas of responsibility? So both areas, the subject area and the geographical area, so that you know whom to call in the country. Or is it just the numbers? Yeah.
Could I take that question, if that's okay, Benoit?
Yeah, go
on. Yes. The difficulty with that is that if you take the example that Jerome just gave, the person in the control room who needs help in another country may not know where in that country they need help, and even if they do know where, if they consult a database that has regional responsibility signaled for, let's say, for example, let's use Germany as an extreme example, who have 500 or 600 PSAPs, they're just not going to have the knowledge to know which PSAP to call. So in terms of bringing, so somebody within the country where the help is needed needs to be able to take that responsibility to make sure they get the help in the location where it's needed. This is just not something that we can facilitate in the database. We have no objection to Germany providing 500 PSAP entries into the database, but for somebody consulting the database who needs to contact a PSAP in Germany, they're not going to know which PSAP to call. So
it means the idea is to have one PSAP per country.
Or
an anchor PSAP, yeah.
Yes, or a primary PSAP and a backup PSAP, or two PSAPs if they want to share the load. That's fine.
Okay.
I think that would work. But if it's going to be hundreds, it's going to be a difficult thing. You know, for a caller, they're just not going to know which one to call.
Sure.
Just to add to that, in a few countries like France and Belgium, for instance, they are thinking about basically having the national crisis center as the national contact point, so that then they would forward the call to the relevant PSAP in the country. This is an example of what can be done.
Which also partly replies to the comment of Jan, whether France and Italy would be in it. I guess that's the plan. And I saw that Shane also asked, so it's a single point of contact per country. Guess Freddie just replied to that. So yes, that's the simplest way. Potentially 2 points of contact with one that will serve as a backup, but ideally one single point of contact per country. Okay, thank you very much also Freddie and Jérôme for bringing some clarifications. I will now move to the next topic because time is running. Yeah, next topic is direct access to 112. Some of you know or guess that, you know, when you go sometimes to a hotel, or this is an example I took from, this is an internal document from for the staff of the European Parliament, that if they want to call the emergency services, they have to dial 85112. And if they dial 112 from their landline phone, the call will not go through to the emergency services, which can have some damaging consequences. So something has been added by the European Parliament, as you see here in the European Electronic Communications Code. I have to say I'm very frustrated by the final wording, because final wording says that member states shall promote the access to emergency services from private networks, which is not so strong, unfortunately. The European Parliament had voted something that was very much clearer and that mandated a direct access to 112. Unfortunately, the provision was a bit watered down by the member states, and that was kind of part of the final agreement. You know, you have to give up on some things and so on. So, but at least something is added in the legislation, which will serve as, let's say, paving the way for next legislation and so on. So, but at least you know that there's something that is now in the legislation that member states should do something to promote direct access to 112. Next item is about calls, what I call multilingual emergency calls, but that's not exactly correct. So calls in other languages. The other language is not the national language, I would say. In that case, there's not a lot you can do in a European legislation, of course, because that's a very sensitive, like language is a very sensitive topic for the member states. Just so you know that something has been added in one of the recitals, so it's not really binding, but just member states should consider the PSAP's ability to handle emergency communication in more than one language. And I guess we all understand the value of that. Next item is promotion of 112. Though 112 was established about 20 years ago, most of the European citizens are still unaware of 112 as a European emergency number. And unfortunately, we don't have DADAS in all the countries to promote 112. So for that reason, there's already a requirement in the legislation that member states should promote 112, the European emergency number 112, not only as a national, but also European number. What is added today with the EECC is that the Commission shall support and complement member states' action, which clearly will not lead to any major change, unfortunately, but at least now the European Commission is officially entitled to do something to support the member states. Another change also is that not only you have to promote 112, but also the accessibility features and how end users with disabilities can contact the emergency services. Okay, we are done with the EECC and what is in it, the provisions. I will now go to the next steps because it's not completely finished. So this is where we are at the moment. So there were some discussions between the EU institutions to reach to an agreement on, and to find a common wording that is acceptable to everyone. This agreement has been found the 5th of June, and I just explained to you what is in this agreement. What is now pending and what will happen in the weeks to come is the formal vote on this agreement. So formal vote is a formality, actually, because the agreement was found between representatives of European Parliament and the Council. So I'm not stressed at all that this will go through. So the formal vote will happen on the 13th of November and at the European Parliament and at the Council on the 4th of December. So yeah, this is just to make this agreement official. This will be followed. It's 2 weeks after the vote at the Council, the directive officially enters into force. So this will happen end of December or maybe beginning of January, because there will be some kind of Christmas break for the EU institutions. And after the directive enters into force, then the member states will have 2 years to transpose the provisions of the directive. And there's just an extended deadline for provisions on public warning systems, where member states will have 18 months extra, so in total 3 years and a half to implement the Article 110. So those are for the next steps. You'll see some communication from EENA to let you know once the formal votes have passed, but the ministries and the public authorities in each country will already be busy to start transposing the provisions that were just explained. And we are done for the EECC, but I'm not finished yet because I would like to give you a short update on the e-privacy regulation, because that's also something that is affecting the emergency services. So we'll go quickly on that, but the e-privacy regulation will replace the e-privacy directive that is from 2002. So as you see, the past legislation is from long time ago, more than 15 years ago. So at that time, the technology was not the same as today. Today we have smartphones, for instance. So this is a regulation. So regulation differs with directive in the fact that all the provisions of the text directly apply, and you don't need to transpose it into the member state's national law. So once it's voted, then it enters into force and it's directly in application, except where specifically mentioned. But also it's slightly different than the famous GDPR. It's about something a bit related, but different actually. And what is important here is that in the Privacy Directive and the upcoming regulation, there is an exemption for the emergency services to basically an exemption from privacy rules to get the phone number of the person calling and the caller location information of the person without asking for the caller's consent. And this is very important that this exemption remains in the new text, and also that as there was some kind of legislative gaps in some countries with the past directive, that sometimes the caller location information did not include handset-derived location information, because, as I said, the directive is from 2002. So it's also very important to make sure that this exemption will include handset-derived caller location information. The text is currently under discussion at the Council, so it's still not voted yet, but I will just show you that basically the exemption remains. You don't have to read everything. Here it says that, here again, the presentation of the calling line identification, and here it says the processing of metadata, so that includes caller location. For this, the emergency services are exempted from the privacy rules. And we have a specific article on caller location that includes, it's clearly said in the paragraph 3 of the article 13 in the bottom, that covers handset-based location. And basically this this provision is also in line with what AML already offers at the moment, which is also a matter of switching on automatically the location functionality of the phone. And something new that will also be in this legislation, if you work in the PSAP, you might be aware of this problem, that when you want to call back a person, sometimes there are some people who just block automatically the calls where there is where the phone numbers are hidden. So in that case, there will be an exemption for the emergency services that their call still go through despite the parameters of the person's phone. But yeah, that's let's not go too much into the detail for the privacy regulation, but just so that you understand a bit that this is also coming. Okay, I'm done. That's it for this presentation. And before ending this call, is there any question?
Yes, Peter Sanders here. Is there also an exemption for reverse 112? For people
no,
dialing 112?
Yeah, I can't hear you very well, but no, there is no exemption for reverse 112. However, when you get into the provisions on reverse 112, here it clearly says that I mean, it clearly sets ways to, you know, that the privacy regulations do not really apply to reverse 112.
Okay, thanks.
There's no big privacy constraint for reverse 112 because you don't store the person's location.
Well, that depends. If you have location-based SMS, you first need to determine who is in the target area.
Yeah, but you don't store this information. You don't, I mean, except if the person gives its consent, but otherwise you just determined that you send an SMS to all the people that are in a specific city, and you don't know which people individually is in this city actually.
But those who you send an SMS to, you know?
No, because it's the users that are connected to a cell.
Users are not connected to a cell, sorry. So this assumption is wrong, Robert speaking. Users are not connected to a cell. So this basic, some fundamental of GSM telecommunication is users are not connected. But we will have some follow-up discussion on this topic, I would recommend.
Yeah, of course, and especially at the national level, the transposition of this provision will be very important. Okay, is there any other question?
Yeah, maybe a short question about the privacy regulation.
Yeah.
Is there any information about when it can be forced?
No.
What's
yeah, I hope as soon as possible. But the fact is that it's still under discussions at the council for like more than 1 year now, and the council is very slow in finding an agreement. Not about this article. This article everybody agrees, but there are some other elements in the legislation that create some tensions. And if there's one message that you pass, that you may pass to the public authorities of your country, is that they should hurry up to find an agreement, because you really need that. Because unfortunately, I can't tell you when this will be agreed. Is there any other question? Okay, I don't hear any. So in any case, you can just get back to me. You can find here my contact details. So just get back to me if you need some information. Anyway, you'll be kept informed of all the advancements at the legislative level. For your information, this presentation and the recording of the webinar will be also shared with you in the next couple of hours.
Okay, Benoit. On behalf of the EENA board, I would like to thank you for this excellent presentation and all the participants for clarification several issues, and everybody was. Most of them were muted all the time, so it was nice to follow this webinar. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Dieter, and thank you everyone for your attention and staying with me during this hour about legislation.
Thank you very much, Benoit. Thank you all.
Thank you, Benoit.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, Benoit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.